Groundwater contamination from underground fuel tanks can be a serious problem. Groundwater interacts with surface water and ecosystems and is used for drinking and irrigation. Loss of product or leaks from underground tanks can be caused by corrosion, unsuitable geotechnical conditions, human error in installation and refilling, and small incremental losses undetected by monitoring. In addition to human health and environmental impacts, contamination of land can have major economic, legal and planning implications for landowners and the wider community.
The problem with the severity and scale of leakages from underground storage tanks is potentially more widespread than it was or is generally anticipated. Historically, about a decade ago, BP produced a statistic that 80% of all service stations leaked at some time during their operation. So it is widespread, and it is possibly an undervalued impact.
Good evening, welcome to another exciting episode of UCT Underground. Today our investigative team literally, I said literally, went underground to find out exactly what goes on during a tank yank. Are we clear to shoot yet? Okay, this is investigative journalism at its best. My UCT team and I went underground to find out what goes on during a tank yank, and this is what the engineer had to say.
This is a site closure. They actually excavated around the tank area, and basically they're clearing the excavation hole to be able to free the tank and remove the tank.
This tank comes out, we will discover whether or not there has been any contamination of water underground.
Collected from inside the excavation. So what we do is we usually put in, we get like a half a bag in an airtight bag like this. We let it stand for a little while, and then this is a PID, it's photo ionization detector. Yeah. It basically picks up whatever vapors escaped from the soil. So that's why we leave this gap and we let it stand for a little while, so that if there is any vapors that will volatilize, it gives it a chance to get out. And then that sort of helps us decide which samples we're sending to the lab.
In terms of impacts to communities associated with product losses, we have had incidences in more rural environments where the local community would be using a spring for potable water supply, in fact the full water supply from washing to drinking, and diesel has migrated into their water source, and instead of recovering water to drink, they're actually recovering diesel.
Petroleum hydrocarbons, once they exit the pipework or the tank, would typically travel downwards underneath under gravity, and once it reaches a less permeable strata or groundwater, it then would expand and migrate laterally and along the groundwater flow direction. In Cape Town we've got two types of aquifers. We've got the fractured bedrock aquifers, and that's what we see in the Camps Bay area, as well as the Cape Flats aquifer, where the contamination will stay shallow on top of the floating on top of the Cape Flats aquifer.
On certain sites you have the risks to your nearby properties or neighbours. For instance, if you have residential properties next to a service station, you have a possible risk to human health with a migrating leak from a tank, a migrating plume moving towards the residential areas, and that can cause human risk.
There was a school that's been using groundwater to to water their fields, sports fields, and the nearby underground storage tank belonging to a fuel station had leaked, and the groundwater had become impacted, and the plume had gone underneath the school, and not underneath the school but underneath the sports fields, and affected the groundwater that they were pumping onto their fields. So the petroleum industry stopped the use of that groundwater and pays for potable water to be supplied by the municipality to the school.
The long-delayed contaminated land provisions in Part 8 of Chapter 4 of the National Environmental Management Waste Act came into effect on the 2nd of May 2014. Whilst the Act came into force on the 1st of July 2009, the contaminated land provisions have been dormant for almost 5 years. Allied with the commencement of contaminated land provisions, the final norms and standards for the remediation of contaminated land and soil quality were published.
The key differences between the National Water Act and NEMA and the contaminated land provisions in the Waste Act are these. First of all, there's only a duty of care in the National Water Act and NEMA, which requires one to take reasonable measures, which is a relatively subjective standard. The other important issue relating to NEMA and the National Water Act is that there's no obligation to report contamination of groundwater or soil. Under the contaminated land provisions of the Waste Act, there is both an obligation to report, and also there are possibilities for the Minister to direct remediation to specific standards, which is quite different from the more subjective situation in NEMA and the National Water Act. A useful practical example of this is a case where a petrol filling station caused contamination of the groundwater, and the groundwater was used by people for domestic purposes. However, because the geohydrology of the area was so complicated and the fractured rock in which the water was situated was just too difficult and therefore too expensive to remediate, it was found to be a reasonable measure simply to supply the groundwater user with an alternative source of water rather than to remediate it, so the problem will continue.
This story doesn't just end here. Threats to our groundwater are on the increase. Just because we can't see it doesn't mean it isn't there.
You need to stop here because we are...
Look around. What you see, this gentleman here, they don't like it that we are here. Don't like it that we are here. This is toxic journalism. Christina, are you getting this? Is that fine?
Could be... Where are you starting? You did that.
Oh, hello? Hello? Yes. Come closer. Come close. This is illegal. Come closer.
I have no idea. Salita has to do
Out of the ground. Pause.
It is a significant problem.